Good evening, everybody. It's time for our first lecture on Freud. We have 3 days for Freud. Um, there'll be a lecture, obviously, from this first section of the reading, and then we'll do one at the end of the reading that will also incorporate the Yellow Wallpaper short story, which you'll also see listed in your syllabus for that third day, along with the third part of Freud. So more reading for next class, and then discussion questions and a lecture for the third class. So we'll do some background information on Freud. There are lots of different um, pictures of Freud that you probably have seen before. Um, this is really the most common one, holding a cigar in his hand. He did end up actually developing mouth cancer, which probably had something to do with his smoking. At least that was sort of common at the time. It was either mouth or jaw cancer. But this picture is used in lots of different places. Kind of a dignified portrait of Freud. It's on the cover of some editions of various Freud texts. Um, so we will look at some biographical information here. So Freud was born in 1856 in Freiburg in Moravia, which is now actually part of the Czech Republic. He did have two half brothers. Interestingly, excuse me, his mother was the same age as his half brothers. And as it says here, this would later fuel some of his ideas about family, relationships, mother, father, children, the development of the human psyche, the impact of siblings, the impact of mother and father, all those kind of things that we tend to identify with Freudian psychology. There's so much of Freud that has become a part of popular culture, and terms that Freud uses that we use today, sometimes correctly or as he would have used those terms, and sometimes not. But he definitely is a part of our sort of collective, not even collective unconscious, but our regular discourse about the human psyche. His father was a Jewish wool merchant, and in 1859, the family moved to Leipzig in Germany and then settled in Vienna, trying to get away from the um, sort of developing anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic attitudes in that part of the world. And then he remained in Vienna until 1938 and died in London in September 23rd, 1939. So right near the beginning of World War I, and certainly saw the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany. And again, anti-Semitism, not just in Germany, but also in Europe in general, and especially in that part of Germany. Um, in addition to that, he's known for being the father of psychoanalysis, right? That's what he's most kind of identified with in the psychological community. He was trained as a doctor. That's really important, and really was a neurologist of the era. Now, obviously, they didn't have the same kind of scientific ability to look at it and understand the human brain or the human mind as we do today. But Freud definitely tried to be, scientific in the work that he did, but there was no doubt going to be some speculation involved in what he was doing. And again, we do understand the human brain certainly better than in Freud's time. Um, I would be careful using brain and mind exchangeably. Brain tends to refer to the physical matter. Mind tends to refer to ideas, beliefs, all those things that we use that um, many of them we believe are obviously stored in the brain. But mind tends to be the way we talk about, what the brain kind of provides us with. And I would also say that there are elements of beliefs and ideas that become embodied too. So ultimately, Many times you'll see mind body hyphenated. I do that in my own work. So just try to keep those straight, right? Brain being the physical matter, and mind is the ideational component that can also incorporate body in terms of things like bodily habits, for example, right? So things that you learn how to do that you used a particular thought process for, that become habit, sort of become embodied, right? So that's a kind of way in which your ideas and thoughts and problem solving results become a part of your body and not just your mind. It says here, Freud qualified as a doctor of medicine in Vienna in 1881, carried out research into cerebral palsy, aphasia, microscopic neuroanatomy at the Vienna General Hospital, again, doing the best they could with that at the time in the late 19th century. And then became a lecturer in neuropathology in 1885 and a professor in 1902. There are a couple things about Freudian psychology that I just want to talk about here briefly too. One is discussed, typically the term that is used is reductionism. And it was a very powerful idea at the time. People tend to use that idea now somewhat critically. And the idea was that Freud believed that he could trace the human psyche, how the human psyche functions, its different components, to human biology, right? To the different components of the human psyche, and particularly, obviously, as we know, because Freud is famous for this, the sex and sexuality, right? And I think, though, most psychologists today would recognize that there are insights that provide this, that sort, Freud provided in terms of the human psyche and things like sex and sexuality. But probably very few people would believe that you can reduce the human psyche, the human mind, our psychological life to any one component, and like, for example, sex and sexuality. Another term that's often used there is overdetermination, right? Trying to use a theory, a belief that might be valuable, it might be in some sense true, um, but to try and account for too much using that belief or using that theory. And I think, again, that most people would claim that Freud indeed did that. So that's one thing. The other thing that's sort of interesting here has to do with one of the obviously main features of Freudian psychology as the role that he gives to the unconscious mind, which he sees as the largest part of the human psyche. And we'll talk about that a little more in a bit. However, at the same time, there have been challenges to the idea of Freudian psychology, and in particular to a practice that's called recovered memory, that I'm sure some of you are aware of. You often see it, for example, in crime shows on TV, where somebody is claiming that they were taken advantage of, that some kind of crime was committed against them, for example, and they know this because the process of psychoanalysis has helped them to retrieve a memory that was repressed because it was very painful. And now that retrieved memory they want to use it for evidence, right? That they were molested or raped or whatever the situation might be. That's typically how it is in these crime shows on TV anyway. However, about this, early in the development of the social sciences, a guy named Karl Popper, eventually Sir Karl Popper, came up with what he called the falsifiability criterion, and wanted to claim that anything that counts as science, it must be clear how you could falsify, a belief, a theory, for it to count as really big, truly scientific. Because Popper claimed that science doesn't move forward by proving things and then amassing those things together, because he argued that any one phenomena can be explained by multiple, in fact, infinite number of possible explanations. And we can't test all those possible explanations, right? So he's starting to challenge this idea, right, that we can have absolute knowledge about things, because he says there are an infinite number of ways of explaining any one phenomenon, and we can never know what all of those are and test all of them. So what he says science really develops and works through is trying to, developing theories certainly, but then trying to punch holes in those theories. And then the same thing happens at a larger level of what's called paradigms, which that might be another term that you're familiar with, right? A paradigm is sort of a lens through which you view some facet of human experience or of the natural world, et cetera. Qualitative research versus quantitative research is sometimes viewed as two different paradigms that challenge each other. We think of different views of the cosmos, right? You have the terracentric view, right, that the Earth is the center of the cosmos, and then the heliocentric view that the sun is the center, right? As we move through the different astronomers to Galileo, today we recognize, for example, that even our galaxy is not our solar system is not the middle of our galaxy, and that there are lots of different galaxies. So we've even kind of moved beyond the paradigm that says that the sun is the center of everything. So these are big picture things, right? These are, as I said, a lens that through which you view, some important aspect of human beings and our place in the world. And they work the same way through falsifiability, right? You have these different paradigms and you try to punch holes in them. Well, the question comes up on whether or not Freudian psychology then is really scientific, because it's not clear how you would falsify certain claims about the unconscious mind or about recovered memory. And there are lots of different debates, discussions, controversies about whether or not recovered memory should be able to be used as evidence in a trial, for example, because it's not clear how you would falsify a recovered memory. In addition to that, we recognize that the human mind actively constructs ideas and meanings, and we've had this. I'm sure you've had this happen with some of your own memories of something, even something you might claim to have a strong memory about. You might misremember it some ways, or that memory might change over time, be reconstructed in different ways, right? Sometimes a recovered memory, when they actually look at the context of the recovered memory, maybe there was somebody else who was actually there at the time who can claim that that recovered memory is actually false. But it's not always clear how that would happen. And again, the unconscious part of the human psyche is the largest part for Freud. So there are lots of debates about whether or not Freudian psychology or certain elements of it are actually scientific or should be considered scientific. In the American Psychological Association, that's something that is, has been hotly debated. So it's an interesting sort of aspect of Freudian psychology. And one reason I mentioned that is another form of psychology that became very powerful that people still also appeal to today, just like they utilize elements of Freudian psychology, is behaviorism, right? And behaviorism is exactly the opposite. Behaviorism historically didn't want anything to do with trying to figure out how the brain works, or the mind works, or what's the nature of consciousness and those kind of things. Because those weren't considered scientific. So behaviorism only looks for outward behaviors, and those outward behaviors, therefore, are supposedly signs that can tell us how the human mind works, right? And we talk about then, conditioning and behaviorism. There are different forms of conditioning, classical and opera conditioning, et cetera. But within the behaviorist paradigm, you want to see an outward behavior as evidence for inferring that there is a piece of knowledge there, right? That somebody knows something, a process or a fact or whatever it might be. And even traditional paper and pencil tests are behaviorist in orientation, right? If you think about even things like the SAT test or other tests where you fill in bubbles, they're stimulus response based, as behaviorism is. The stimulus is a test question. A response is, did you bubble in the right bubble? Now, you might have bubbled in the right bubble by accident, but it's inferred that you know something, whatever that question was asking you, the answer to it because you bubbled in the correct bubble. But again, that's just inferred because we don't know if you bubbled in the right bubble because you knew the answer or just guessed correctly. Similarly, you can bubble in the wrong bubble and understand most of the question and just get part of it wrong, and your answer appears to be wrong, and it looks like you don't understand any aspect of it because you bubbled in the wrong bubble. And as we know, depending on the test, sometimes People taking those kind of tests will just sort of make Christmas trees out of the bubbles and other kinds of things if they're not taking the test very seriously, right? So that shows where the limits of behaviorism are. A good example I often use with my teacher education students is the idea of what's called on-taskness in a classroom, right? To see if students are on task, you might look at whether or not they look like they're taking notes or look like they're reading from their books, and you say they're on task. And that's a good sign, right? That the students are probably learning something. Well, they could be daydreaming, they could be drawing pictures and not taking notes, right? So on-taskness, again, is something that's used in behavioral psychology or an application of it to infer that students are doing what they're supposed to be doing when they might not be doing it, right? So we sort of have the two opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of psychology when you look at Freudian psychology on the one hand and behaviorism on the other hand. And behaviorism, in fact, was designed to not give us the kinds of problems that Freudian psychology provides us with, which is how would we, falsify something. And in behaviorism, the idea is, well, if you don't see the right behavior, that is, that's enough evidence as you can possibly have to know about whether or not somebody knows something, believes something, whether it be a process or a fact or something like that. So that's, I think, an important aspect of Freudian psychology. There are some other things that I think are interesting that have to do with the time period in which Freud was working. Freud was doing a lot of his writing in the real mature part of his career during World War One. World War One is, as many of you know, and I'm not sure if I've talked about it before or not, perhaps not, was very traumatic. It was a long, bloody war. It was a war of what's called trench warfare, right, where people are living for days and weeks on end in trenches. The technologies of war had outstripped the ideas for how you actually prosecute a war. It's the tactics or strategy. So that as the war began, people tried to mass troops and charge the enemy as they did in previous wars, but that didn't work because before you could get to your enemy would shoot you down. They could hide behind things or again in trenches, etc., and protect themselves. And it was just mass slaughter. That's where the idea of no man's land comes from in warfare, and particularly in World War One. And as again, I might have mentioned before, the first of the new Wonder Woman movies, there's a great, very realistic looking kind of scene of that where Wonder Woman jumps out of the trench across no man's land. And you just see it's full of dead bodies and trees that have been shot apart. And there's nothing really that can survive in no man's land, which is why it was given that term. Things did loosen up a little bit later in World War One because of the development of the airplane, which could fly over trenches. They were first used just to spy on your enemy, and then people started dropping things out of planes. And then pilots started shooting at one another, and then they put machine guns in the planes, etc. The other thing was armored vehicles allowed you to cross no man's land, right? So early tanks and personnel carriers and other kinds of things. But it was a terrible war. Many people died from disease, more people than were actually shot during the war. Again, it lasted a long time. And it really had an impact on the psyche of human beings. It was torturous. It created great pain and great trauma. People who fought in that war, this is true of all wars, but I think World War One in particular, really suffered psychologically the rest of their lives after they fought the war. And people who are trying to portray the war visually in things other than in photographs were finding that they needed to develop sort of a new art form to be able to do it, to really be able to portray the trauma that occurs to the human mind through these extreme kind of really painful circumstances. And realistic art just didn't quite do it, right? It could tell you the way things looked, the way people looked, etc., but it didn't tell you what was going on inside them. And what developed is what's called surrealistic art, right? Surrealism. And I'm sure you're familiar with some surrealistic art. The picture I have up here of actually the edition of Civilization and Its Discontents that I use. That's an older edition that I used to use for the class. You can see on the cover here, and a good example of surrealistic art. Probably René Magritte, maybe Salvador Dali, he might be the best known of the surrealistic artists with his paintings of melting clocks and that sort of thing. But the idea is that you had to do something that could give somebody some kind of sense for what was going on inside the human mind when it was undergoing these very traumatic, painful kinds of experiences. And here's an example of that on the cover of this old Penguin Classics edition of Civilization and Its Discontents. I had to actually work hard to try to find this picture because I guess the book has been out of print for a while. If you look at World War I art, if you look at propaganda that was developed around World War I, you will often see this kind of surrealistic art and people that were actually hired to do these propaganda paintings and art would often use different elements of surrealism. And of course, Freud was very interested in what was going on inside the mind and the human psyche, and when it became traumatized, the pain that it would suffer from, how you would deal with that. And again, psychoanalysis was a way of dealing with it, taking very painful repressed memories and trying to bring them to the surface so people could deal with them in a way that would hopefully make them more healthy psychologically to overcome various kinds of difficulties that they would suffer, psychological difficulties that they would suffer through repressed memories of one kind or another. So that's a little bit on surrealistic art. One of the things that comes out in the just give me a second here, trying to put up a picture. That's discussed early in Civilization and Its Discontents in other of Freud's texts, has to do with his views about religion. Right? He talks about a friend having written to him about what's called the oceanic feeling, this feeling about being connected with something much larger than yourself. And this person wants to claim that that's the source of religion. And you can tell in reading Civilization and Its Discontents, especially part one, that Freud was not deeply religious himself, certainly by any means, and was very critical of religion, actually found it to be somewhat infantile. I think he really believed that it made it harder for people to have a healthy psychological life sometimes if they really had strong and very dogmatic kinds of religious beliefs that made it difficult for them to deal with their psychological life. I think you would also acknowledge that it also did some value to people depending on what your life was like and what kind of experiences you had. So that many people would argue that religion could just do just the opposite as well. But he wanted to claim to this individual that it really wasn't the religious that he would relate to this oceanic feeling, but instead he claimed that that oceanic feeling comes from being in the womb and being a very young child, and you have that sense of connectedness to your mother and the safety and security that comes from that connection, right? And that as you grow up, you're always trying to recover that sense of connection, that safety, security of being part of something bigger than you, right? And Freud says that actually is where religion comes from in his belief, is that desire to reconnect with something larger than yourself to get that sense of security and safety back. And that what basically happens is as you get older, you get to the point in development, and this is something that developmental psychologists will talk a lot about, where you start to distinguish yourself from other people and from the outside world, right? Everything is subjective at first. Everything is in relation to yourself. And then you start to have this subject-object differentiation right? When you realize that there are things that are apart from you. And the most painful, most difficult one is your mother, right? Who provides you with that ultimate safety and security. And as you really realize that you're kind of on your own in the world ultimately, and you don't have that sense of this real primal connection to something larger than yourself, that people are trying to always in their lives trying to recover that in one way or another and use different things to try and recover it with. Um, certain kinds of philosophy, for example, and where philosophy shades into religion, the same sort of thing. Mysticism is a good example. You see mysticism in the arts quite a bit, as you see religion, and it kind of representing that aspect of religion that connects you with something larger than yourself. Um, Freud was obviously critical of religion. I just wanted to throw up here a couple of the critiques because they do appear in Civilization and Its Discontents. He says, there is no advice that would be beneficial to all in achieving happiness. Everyone must discover for himself how he can achieve salvation. That is, in other words, how can you attempt to achieve happiness, a sense of connectedness and belongingness. And then it's different for everybody, but the religion tries to give everybody the same, way of trying to achieve happiness, and that's really impossible because we are all different. We grow and develop differently. Our parents are different. Our early psychological life is very different. You may have noticed a similar kind of critique in Mary Wollstonecraft when she talked about the fact that everybody has to have their own connection with the divine. And that's where she's critical of really dogmatic kinds of religions and of teaching specific religions in schools, et cetera. It forces everybody to try to find that sense of connection and belonging through the same, religious beliefs, et cetera. Freud also says religion forces on everyone indiscriminately its own path to the attainment of happiness and protection from suffering. And again, he's going to use terms that you can show. You can see that he's very critical here, right? You see what he's very much a rhetorician. He very much is somebody who uses very specific rhetoric, either uses terms that we already know in different ways, or he develops new terms to try and explain things. And using the word indiscriminately here obviously kind of suggests that that it doesn't discriminate. It doesn't allow each person to find their connection, their beliefs. There was a philosophy that was developing that we talked about already called existentialism that was developing in the 19th century that tried to challenge that aspect of religion. And again, as I said, many existentialists were atheists, but I also pointed out, and I think one of my Dostoevsky lectures, that there were also deeply religious um, existentialists, but they tended to really believe that they were critical of or made uncomfortable with institutionalized religion and religion that was all about ceremony and dogma, because it didn't allow people to have their own personal relationship with God, without all of those kinds of trappings, without those kinds of things that take away your individuality, right? So there were, and I think this is important, people like Søren Kierkegaard, for example, or Martin Buber, or Rilke, other existentialist philosophers and thinkers, including Dostoevsky himself, right? And as we talked about, ended up embracing Orthodox Christianity of his youth, again in his mature years after experimenting with other kinds of beliefs, where we saw some parallels between Dostoevsky himself and Raskolnikov, right? So this is something that people who are religious themselves had tried to deal with, some of these criticisms that Freud makes here. And I would say that the more religious of the existentialists would be a good example of that. So again, Freud's terminology is something that I think people tend to be very aware of. It has become a part of our common culture. You see it not just when intellectuals are talking about the human psyche, but you see it in movies and television, in books, I mean, all kinds of things, because these terms are very much freighted with really deep meanings, very significant meanings, and they're sort of seem to be useful in summing up people's behaviors, what's motivating them to act in a certain ways. How would you characterize them? And probably the big three here for Freud that he discusses are the id, the ego, and the superego. The biggest part of the human psyche is, as I said before, the unconscious mind. And that relates to the id, which actually translates as it. And the id is essentially human biology, our biological drives. As it says here, strives to satisfy basic sexual and aggressive tendencies, operating on the pleasure principle, right? Fulfilling those needs of our biological being, demanding immediate gratification. And it's not just sexuality, even though Freud emphasizes sexuality and seems to read sexuality into everything, but our desires for food, for example, right? That's the same idea. So if we want to think about maybe the two biggest things, sexuality and food, um, as we know, when we're feeling those needs, there's this drive to satisfy those needs immediately, to want immediate gratification, right? And certainly you can think about that in terms of not just sexuality, but food. When you're hungry and your stomach's growling and you feel that pit in your stomach, you want to satisfy that need immediately, right? It's a part of your survival, right? These basic drives are part of the survival of human beings. Freud says we need sexuality to survive as human beings. And certainly the species needs sexuality to survive. You need to have food and a certain degree of safety and those kinds of things, right? So these are those sort of innate drives that we all feel. And the question is how and when are we going to fulfill those drives? So that's the id. The ego, as it says here, is part of the executive function. It tries to mediate between the id and what's called the superego. People's sense of self, how they would talk and think about themselves, their identity. If you ask them the different facets of their identity, this is something we've been doing a lot at Geneseo recently through our diversity and equity initiatives in thinking about race, ethnicity, how we think about race, the anti-racism, anti-biased education. And a big part of that in kind of figuring that out in that kind of educational process is figuring out your own identity, how you identify yourself, what's most important to you about your identity. And is an important part of that kind of education and becoming aware of those things to live in a more equitable society and to treat people more justly who are different than we are, right? And that sense of identity is a part of the ego as Freud talks about it. Then there is the superego. The superego gives us kind of standards for judgment. Our conscience kind of comes from the superego, right? Morally, ethically, the kind of person that we would like to be. And the superego develops both from our families, where we get a sense of right and wrong. When we're very young, maybe older siblings, family and extended family, I would say for many people, and also from society at large, right? Laws certainly have embedded in them ethical and moral principles, but there are other kinds of ethical and moral principles. Some are provided by religion and our faith commitments, right? Other kind of things, just a part of our culture, our society, our community. All those things provide those standards for judgment of our behaviors, etc. Some focus more on our actions. Some also focus on our ideas and beliefs. And those can be the ones that can be very traumatizing, right? Where you are, your conscience tells you that you're unethical, you're immoral, maybe you're a sinner, just for having certain kinds of ideas or beliefs, even if you don't act on them, right? Versus actually acting on those ideas and beliefs, which is, I think, where many people would want to make some of those judgments, right, about whether or not somebody is moral, ethical. Certainly that's the way the legal system works, right? You are not going to be thrown in jail for wishing that somebody was dead, right? Only for murdering them. However, you can still be considered based on your superego and how it develops and the different sources of what goes into your conscience, very condemnatory of yourself for even having that thought about wanting to do away with somebody else. And the way that this was kind of put together here, you see the ego as it in between the superego and the id, right? Kind of mediating between them, right? Because the id wants to fulfill these drives immediately. The superego says, hey, wait a minute, right? Society, if we use that term as a broad term to encompass all those things that I mentioned that give us are the source of our superego. It tells us that, wait a minute, you have to find both the right time and place to fulfill those drives and the right way to do it, a way that with the society, which again can incorporate family, your community, your religious beliefs, other kinds of things, will tell you how you can fulfill those. And that's largely where civilization comes in for Freud, right? So in Civilization and Its Discontents, the idea behind the book here, right, is that it's a duality for Freud. We need civilization. We need something that tells us how to behave, how and when and through what mechanisms to fulfill those drives that come from the id, right? And because they demand immediate gratification, what mediates that? Because we know that we can't just have that immediate gratification in the vast number of instances in our lives. So we need civilization. On the other hand, Freud says there are more and less healthy ways in which civilization will tell us to do that, right? If civilization, for example, is telling us complete abstinence when it comes to, let's say, sexuality, or if we constantly get messages that in very powerful ways mediate how our nutrition, right? That can be very damaging, right? But civilization can also provide us with maybe some healthier ways of mediating those drives, right? We have certain ways in which we deal with human sexuality, right? Not in public, but in privacy, for example. Times and places where we eat, and places where we don't, right? So Freud recognizes that civilization, that there are healthy and less healthy ways in which civilization mediates our fulfilling of these drives. But I think overall he wants to emphasize, because he was very interested in these things, the ways in which it causes us pain and suffering through things like abstinence, or through telling us we shouldn't try and fulfill those needs, right? Prohibitions on fulfilling those needs. And that's where the source of our greatest psychological traumas come from for Freud. So civilization for him can make us discontent, can make us unhappy, right? And limiting and creating these prohibitions on how we fulfill the needs of the id. But at the same time, we do need it, right? Or we'd just be living in chaos. Everything would be like sort of the Lord of the Flies kind of existence, right? But there are times and places and ways historically in which civilization, I think Freud would say, did a better job and a less good job. Victorian morality, for example, I think he would find extremely limiting, right? Because it really limited how we fulfilled the needs of the id, and very specific kinds of etiquette and when it's proper to do things and how to do things, that led to all kinds of repression and all kinds of psychological challenges and difficulties for people. There are other areas that we go through socially in society that open up our those prohibitions, or relax those prohibitions in ways and in times. Certainly, the way we view sexuality today is very different in many ways from Victorian sexuality. Even religion and religious beliefs and principles, etc., do change over time, and might potentially, those prohibitions might soften a little bit. You've seen those, I would say, in certain ways in the Catholic Church, for example. Or as we move from Puritan or Calvinist religions to Unitarianism, for example, if you think about the Protestant Reformation, all of those things changed those prohibitions, changed those dogmas, and I think Freud would say helped us to better deal with the id in a more healthy way, at least from his perspective. So if we want to look at how these different elements, what they kind of look like here, there's a really helpful sort of model that typically is called the iceberg model. This iceberg model is actually used for from different things too, um, in terms of the human mind and how it works. But this is the iceberg model of Freud. So you see that there are three levels here: the conscious level, the subconscious level, and the unconscious level. And again, the unconscious level is the largest by far of the three, because that's the biggest part of our psyche for Freud. So you can see at the conscious level are thoughts and perceptions. Whatever um, is sort of immediately in our minds. It's what is present with us, active in our experiences, or things that kind of can immediately sort of be brought to that level of consciousness. Sometimes certain kinds of memories are included there. For example, remembering something that that you really know well and that you can bring to your conscious mind right away, but might not be there, all the time. Most of our memories, things that we learn and kind of store away but can recall, would be at the subconscious level. So it says stored knowledge there, right? If you are cramming for a test, right? A lot of that is that stored knowledge that you hope you can bring to the conscious level while you're taking your test, right? It's there somewhere, but sometimes it's hard to recall it, right? Sometimes people will tell you that that everything that you at one point knew, it's in your mind somewhere, or it's encoded in your brain somewhere, but you tend to need a very specific kind of situation to recall some of what that stored knowledge is. And typically, I think there's a pretty general understanding and appreciation for the fact that it's easier to recall that stored knowledge if you're in the same environment trying to recall it than when you stored it, right? And there's been research that's been done on this, right? If you're studying for something, studying for an exam, and it's material that you were introduced to and took your notes in your classroom, that you're more likely to recall it better back in that same classroom again than if you're in a different environment. It's actually been shown that when students take things like the SAT, that they will do better on that test taking it in their own school than taking it at another school. Some of that is comfort level of the environment, but I think certainly some of it as well is it's easier to recover stored knowledge and memories in the same environment in which you initially learned that material. So that's the subconscious level. Again, the unconscious level is the largest, and you'll see how biological these things are related here. So fears, right, are tied to our drive to stay alive, right, which is obviously very important to us. Violent motives that might be tied to sexuality or the need for food, those kind of things, right? Unacceptable sexual desires, irrational wishes, immoral urges, shameful experiences, and selfish needs. And Freud says we both have a drive to stay alive, to maintain ourselves, that comes out of the id. And as his thought matured over time, he also kind of recognizes there's a death drive. It's called thanatos. And that death drive and the drive to kind of stay alive are there at the same time in all of us. And the reason that death drive is so important is because that death drive will often manifest itself in a desire for peace and an end of suffering and pain and discomfort, right? Wanting to be back in the womb again, that sort of desire. I know I've talked about it before in terms of um, water or the ocean, and not just the references to purity, but that reference to being back in the womb again. We saw it in Frankenstein, for example. right? I think sometimes in the desire for suicide through drowning, you'll sometimes see that. Um, so and it's ultimately, people who are feeling a lot of pain and suffering in their lives, right? So the desire people develop and sometimes act on to commit suicide can be tied to, I would think Freud would say it was tied to thanatos. There are other ways in which people try to achieve that sense of peace through philosophy and through religion and certain kind of religious practices, or things like yoga, meditation, etc. Right, to try to calm those desires, because often our pain comes from our desires. Those desires that we cannot fulfill immediately cause pain, right? And the more desires you have and the more needs you have, probably the more pain you're going to suffer unless you can fulfill those needs, right? Um, so one way to, in some sense, live a happier life for Freud is to not magnify your desires and your needs, right? And certainly, if you think about our materialistic society that we live in, we don't do a very good job of that, I would think Freud would say. And we often need other people and maybe the control of other people, to try to get to get things through other people, to use them, maybe even to steal from them or take advantage of them, because we have these needs or desires that outstrip our ability to fulfill those needs or desires ourselves, and that causes pain and suffering that leads us to do things that are immoral, unethical, illegal, sort of, etc. So the id is extremely powerful, right? So this is something that it comes up against the superego. The superego, it belongs to, I'd say, in large part, the conscious and the subconscious level is where most of the superego is located, right? And trying to control the id, right, which is the largest of the three blue areas there. And then the ego probably shades a little bit into the subconscious level, but the ego, I'd say, a lot of times is also is maybe mostly at the conscious level. So ego and superego shades in and out of the conscious and the subconscious level. Um, the id mostly comes out of the unconscious level. But there are times when if we become conscious of it, right? That's when we feel that need to fulfill those needs, when we're really hungry or have a desire for sex or something else that's a basic, biological drive that we need to fulfill. So I talked a little bit about suffering for Freud and where suffering comes from. So we'll talk about that a little bit here. And there are three main sources of suffering. And then there are different ways in which we try and ease that suffering. One of those sources is the human body. It's weak, it feels pain, it dies, right? That's pretty obvious. We all kind of go through that. And we do lots of things to try and fend that off, with medications, intoxicants, trying to stay in shape physically can maybe be a way to deal with that. Other kinds of practices that try to maintain our bodily health as much as we can, where we eat, etc. Then there's the world, which is largely here is sort of nature, things that are out of our control, natural events, events around us that we can't really do anything about. The obvious examples for that would be sort of natural disasters, right? But there are other things that come from the outside world that really impact us. Social relations, right? Society as a whole and other human beings individually cause suffering and limit our satisfaction, right? And this is obviously a big one for Freud, because this is where the super ego can really kick in and functions to limit the way in which we fulfill or try to fulfill our basic drives, those needs of the id. So those are the main three sources of suffering. And Freud goes through a list of ways in which we try to fulfill those needs. Some I've already talked about, but he talks about these throughout the chapter 2 of Civilization is Discontent. So I talked about intoxication, controlling our needs, limiting our needs, sublimation. We take those needs and try and fulfill them through other kinds of means. Um, again, called sublimation. We'll talk a little more about that. Escapism of one kind or another. Love is a big one, and maybe the biggest one, that we try to deal with human suffering for our attachments to other people. And it's maybe the most powerful way of dealing with suffering. Man is naturally a social animal, as Aristotle once put it. But the other side of love is loss, which causes the greatest suffering sometimes that we deal with, right? So that love is some sense that double-edged sword, as anybody who's been in a relationship probably knows. Beauty, the appreciation of beauty is another thing that can help us to deal with suffering. And maybe kind of entertainments, though a lot of our entertainments probably, Freud would say, fall under escapism, rather than an appreciation of beauty, but he would also include that. And so some of those are more or less successful at helping us deal with suffering. But I would still, Freud still pretty much clearly says that suffering tends to be, for most people, the dominant state that they live in. Some degree of suffering, of pain, of psychological suffering having to do with relationships, things beyond their control, right? Being cold, being too hot, having relationships that go bad, having enemies, our own physical frailties, right? All those kinds of things. So those are the three sources of suffering and the ways in which we try and deal with them. There are also defense mechanisms that we try to use, and I'm going to talk through those briefly. There's some general kinds of defense mechanisms, and there are more some kind of specific ways in which we try and deal with them. The most common defense mechanisms here are displacement. Take your anger out on somebody else, right? And that can be difficult, especially when we do it with our children or with young people or our pets, maybe, right? And it's something people tend to feel really bad about afterwards, because they know that it's not that person or that other being of some kind that we displace our anger on, who is responsible for it. And it's something we really try and be careful about, but inevitably it does happen. We probably all find ourselves sometimes apologizing to people for being angry at them when we're actually angry at something else or some other situation. Repression is where you try and repress. Take that suffering that you're experiencing with your experience, and maybe a traumatic event in particular, and submerge it into your unconscious mind the best you can, or into your subconscious. In the picture here, right, you're building a brick wall up around it. Here, the example is obviously an anger that somebody else is showing towards this person, so they're building that brick wall. That's where psychoanalysis comes in for Freud, and most powerfully, which is this idea that if you repress things, they typically cause all kinds of psychological maladies and psychoses. And what psychoanalysis does is helps to bring those things to the surface so we can deal with them more healthily. There is a kind of a study guide that I put in Canvas that talks about these things. Excuse me. And the person who put it together gives an example of this, where there was he was watching TV with his daughter, and they're watching some cartoon for kids. He said it was the Smurfs or something like that. So he obviously wrote this quite a while ago. But think of a kind of a it's really benign child's cartoon, and he says that somehow who was matching up the commercials with the show made the mistake, and there was a commercial for a horror movie of some kind, right, a Freddy Krueger movie or whatever it was, that somehow came on during the time that this children's show was on, and he's watching this and thinking, oh my God, what's this doing to my child? And being the good sort of psychologist that he is, he knows she could be very traumatized, and he needs to help her deal with it. So he says, "Boy, that was a scary commercial, wasn't it?" And so tries to talk about it a little bit with her, and she says, "What commercial? What are you talking about?" Right? Automatically, her mind, her psyche had repressed it, because especially at her age, it was something way beyond what she was able to deal with. and so it became repressed. Maybe he helped her later in her life to deal with it, if it caused her various kinds of psychological maladies and psychoses. But so it's a kind of a safety mechanism, right? And sometimes we are at least somewhat conscious of the fact that we repressed something. In this instance with his daughter, we might want to say that that was kind of a built-in mechanism of repression, that just took that experience and just stored it deeply away as soon as it was had. Then there's sublimation. They're different, more or less healthy ways of dealing with your anger, right? If you're somebody who deals with a lot of anger in your life, maybe you would become a boxer, or have a kind of a job that involves a lot of vigorous physical activity that you can deal with that anger with, right? So sublimation is very common. Freud would read sublimation into a lot of people's career choices, right? The career choices, he would say, might tell you about the what kind of psyche you have, and what kind of experiences you've had in your life, are going to shape your career choices, because those might provide various kinds of sublimation for you, for your psyche, and then kind of the needs that you have, some of the difficulties you've experienced or encountered in your life. And I think we all kind of recognize that. Again, this is where so many elements of Freudian psychology become part of our common parlance and common culture. And then there's regression, right? This person can't deal with something that they're experiencing, this business person, so they're kind of acting like a little child, right? Regressing back to that state of being a child again, where it's just sort of like, this is beyond me, I can't deal with it. And we've all probably had moments when we regress back to childhood because we're experiencing some kind of pain that we can't deal with, right? So these are common defense mechanisms. There are other ones, but these are some of the three of the most common ones. And this is a sort of a table that gets a little more specific about these kinds of mechanisms that we use. See if I can share that here. So again, repression, regression, displacement, sublimation, reaction formation, projection, rationalization. So this gives us more to choose from here. Repression, we talked about unknowingly placing an unpleasant memory or thought into the unconscious. I think sometimes there can be somewhat of a conscious element of that. So the example, not remembering a traumatic incident, right? Regression, reverting back to an immature behavior, throwing a temper tantrum as an adult, right, when you don't get your way. Displacement, redirecting those kind of unacceptable feelings that we have, or those, emotions, strong emotions that we have, and taking them out on somebody else, your boss, your spouse, your children, your dog, whatever. Sublimation, replacing socially unacceptable impulses, right, or ways of dealing with anger or frustration or other kinds of needs that we have. We need to fulfill those needs. People, for example, who have sexual needs, maybe that are unfulfilled, and channeling the aggressive drives that kind of come out of that into something else, playing football, inappropriate sexual desires, into art. Freud, taught people how to think about their artistic outlets and their artistic desires, and how those speak to sexuality, and the people who have real creative kinds of careers or hobbies, right? Often it's a way of dealing with sexuality. Reaction formation acting in the exact opposite way to the impulses that you have. So maybe being overprotective or lavishing attention on an unwanted child. Projecting, attributing one's own acceptable feelings and thoughts to other people and not yourself. Accusing your boyfriend of cheating on you because you have felt like cheating on him, for example. Rationalization, creating false excuses for one's acceptable thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, right? So justifying cheating or doing something wrong by saying everybody else cheats, everybody else does this or that. That's rationalization. So that gives us, a more inclusive set of different ways that we have, different kind of defense mechanisms that we have to deal with these things that we experience. Just a couple other issues I wanted to talk about briefly because I think they're important. First one, you may have noticed that Freud uses often the words pleasure and happiness somewhat interchangeably. He says that, as many people have, again, going at least as far back as Aristotle, that everybody's ultimate desire in their life is for happiness, right? And that because of that, we have to find different ways of dealing with the suffering and the pain that we have in our lives, and to try and minimize that suffering and pain, right? I talked about utilitarian ethics and the different kinds of um, economic arrangements and political arrangements related to utilitarianism as having that basic same kind of dynamic at work. Maximizing happiness, minimizing suffering and pain. Freud really tends to use pleasure and happiness interchangeably here in a way that I think is problematic. I think when we think about pleasure, typically we think about things that are more transient. It tends to be more biological. We think of pleasures that we have pleasure, experience pleasure on and off. And typically it's tied to directly fulfilling our biological needs and biological drives. I think happiness is more than that. It's more than just biological. I think that it can be a more general state that one experiences. The translation in Greek for the word eudaimonia, it's often translated in Aristotle as happiness. Another translation is human flourishing, and I kind of like it better. To flourish as a human being, to be self-realized, to have a sense of agency, to be in good relationships, and all those kinds of things. Yes, sometimes within that, your pleasure is important. Things like sexuality and having your needs fulfilled. But I would argue that happiness can be a kind of a baseline that people experience, even if they experience suffering at times, right? If you ask people, are you basically happy? I think a lot of people would say, yeah, they're basically happy. Whereas Freud wants to say, no, most people, experiencing pain and suffering most of the time, etc. And I think that's because when he talks about happiness and conflates it with pleasure, he makes happiness seem more transient, more temporary. And again, everything seems to reduce to the biological, our being and sexuality kind of within that. Most psychologists, I would think, again, would say that there's value in Freudian psychology, but that he really does overdetermine things. That too much is explained through sexuality. The Oedipus complex, for example, right? Wanting to kill your father and marry your mother, right? And we think about the plays about Oedipus. A good example of that. That psychologists today would argue that most people don't literally have a desire to murder their father and marry their mother. But things like that can occur in unhealthy families, and healthies that don't deal with sexuality and sex ed and the relationships between people and families and et cetera, that don't deal with those things well, that something like the Oedipus complex, can really surface. So that's where Freud, I think, is kind of most valuable. But I think that conflating pleasure and happiness is problematic in my own thinking. And I've looked at several editions of the book, and these are obviously translated into English, and saw that he really did use different terminology there to talk about pleasure and happiness. And he really does seem to interchange them in ways that sometimes the context is different enough that you can see why he interchanged the terms, but too much he seems to want to reduce happiness to pleasure. And again, I find that problematic. One other thing that we have talked about before that is problematic, and again, I think many folks today would say the same thing. You'll remember when we talked about Locke's social contract, right? The idea that you are an individual, and you decide whether or not to become a permanent member of a society. Once, let's say, you reach the age of 18, and when you receive the age of 18, you can go live somewhere else if you want, or if you want to stay in your society, but you want to change that society, you can get involved in politics or whatever else it might be. But that it's kind of like you are an individual in the full sense of an individual. And then there's this decision whether or not to enter society, right? And I pointed out the great problem with that, which is that society starts influencing us from the time that we're almost come into the world. And I may have given you the example of how my wife and I, when we were birthing classes, before our daughter was even born, I had the blue name tag. My wife had the pink name tag. They're having you think about what color to paint the nursery for your child before the child is even born and brought home. And so from day one or even before that, there are efforts to kind of to influence young children and babies when it comes to things like gender socialization, which is the example I just gave, but other kinds of things as well. The development of language, right, which is key. The development of our sense of identity. All those things obviously occur way before the time that we're 18, and that social contract starts to operate, especially if you're thinking about social contract in terms of Aristotle or Plato and Socrates, and you can also see that social contract in Plato's writing about Socrates. And for example, a piece called the Crito about Socrates in prison before his death. The same thing you can see in Freud, right? When he talks about freedom and then he talks about civilization, his discussion of freedom tends to really emphasize, first of all, what's called negative freedom, which you also see in Locke, that freedom is only about freedom from control. Freedom is removing constraints to our control. So that really being free is being able to do whatever you want. A lot of people today would say, no, that negative freedom is a kind of a faulty notion, that freedom to be meaningful, you have to have certain resources to be able to actualize your freedom. If you're free, but you're poor and you're homeless and you're uneducated, are you really free in any kind of meaningful sense? Probably no, right? Freedom would involve having food, clothing, shelter, and education, right? Those kinds of things. That's what's often called positive freedom. An example, again, I frequently give is the slaves after they were emancipated, but before that they had education and other kinds of jobs, right? They were free in some sense, but largely was that negative freedom, which is why many of them ended up being sharecroppers because they didn't have opportunities to be anything more than sharecroppers, right? If they didn't have any education, there were no other kind of jobs available. They were back working sometimes on the same plantation again under slightly different rules because legally they were free, but where were they going to go? They had that negative freedom. They didn't have positive freedom. And I don't think, again, that Freud really recognizes freedom and individuality. He tends to view individuality as, sort of you're an individual numerically, but in any kind of meaningful sense, in a sense in which you have meaningful freedom. You don't have that before civilization and before society starts influencing you, right? You have boundaries that you're given, even from a really young age. There is gender socialization that goes on, right? There are all kinds of things that really sort of influencing you from the very beginning. So this idea that somehow you are an individual that over and against society or civilization, I think is really problematic the way he talks about it, because I don't think you're really an individual in a meaningful sense, right? Because we're not self-realized beings, right? There are all kinds of things that we need to have to be an individual in anything more than just a numerical sense. And again, I think Freud is problematic in that way as well. Not in everything he says, but I think certainly it's lurking in the background, as is this using the terms pleasure and happiness interchangeably. So that is my first Freud lecture. I hope you found that helpful. I think I hit on all the major things from the first part of the reading. When I do my second lecture, after we've read the whole book, I'll add some more things to that. I'll also talk a good bit about the yellow wallpaper, which we also have due that third day that we're reading Freud. Please read that. It's a short story. It's very powerful. I think some students find that for them, it's the most interesting and engaging and maybe important thing that they read during the semester, maybe along with the Elie Wiesel trilogy that we'll read at the end of the semester. Elie Wiesel's experience during the Holocaust, that obviously really sticks with people too and is very engaging and obviously an important read. But I think many students find the yellow wallpaper also really important and valuable and engaging for them. So please take the time to read that. And then there are also discussion questions that are due then as well. That if I haven't already, I'll make those public. I think I've already shared those, but if I haven't, I'll go ahead and do that. So again, that's my lecture for today, my first Freud lecture, and I hope you found it useful. And I will see you again next time.